All right. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to have you guys here. My name is Brianna Coma, and I'm from Conservation, Nebraska. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to learn more about prescribed burning tonight. A couple of reminders as we let people trickle on in here. Um, you guys, sorry, I jumbled my words for a second. Your mics are all muted and your cameras are off, so you cannot be seen or heard. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can throw them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. And we did have a few at registration time, so we'll get to those first at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, so if you guys missed anything or want to share it with anybody, it will be on Conservation Nebraska's YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. But with all that being said, let's get the sparks flying by talking more about prescribed burning with Cacey Wilken. They are a conservation field technician for Spring Creek Prairie Audubon Center, as well as an active member of the Tri-County Prescribed Burn Association, and holds a red card and wildland firefighter certification. They have also done limnotic research and co-authored the street tree plan for the city of Lincoln. Now I will hand it on over to Cacey to get us started.
Thanks, Brianna, and thank you guys for hosting this. I've been really looking forward, so I'm glad everybody made it out tonight. So I'm going to share my screen and we will jump right in. All right, can you see that?
No, not yet.
No, not yet, of course. Okay. There we go, better?
Yes, there it
Cool.
is.
Cool. So this is a picture of Spring Creek. And so I work out there and it is the coolest place. We focus on tall grass prairie conservation and especially with special respect for the birds. Audubon as a whole works across the whole country, centers and chapters all across the country working on bird conservation. Spring Creek is 850 acres of tall grass prairie and all of the associated habitats that come with that. You can see in that picture, we've got a whole bunch of ponds, marshy draws. We've got a bunch of woodlands to this direction, and then our nice little windbreak going on. We have over 4 miles of walking trails and a bunch of different programs that are really fun. So if you guys ever want to make it out there, it's a little bit southwest of Lincoln, about 15 minutes out by Denton. Oh, and if there's any landowners out there, we do in fact pay our taxes even though we're a nonprofit. So we recently adopted a land acknowledgement. So if everybody wouldn't mind taking a quiet minute to read this over, that'd be great. Thank you guys. So to start off, I'm going to be talking a lot about managing for certain plants. So I kind of want to get a baseline. I'm sure a lot of you know this already. But there's a lot of debate about certain plants, whether they're good or bad. And it really depends on your management perspective and objectives and what kind of types of habitat you're looking for, if you're a grazing operation, if you're trying to restore prairie, all those different things. But generally, plants and animals can be classified into whether they're native, whether they're from either a certain country like the United States or a region like the tallgrass prairie. And for the most part, I'm going to be talking about nativeness to the tallgrass prairie. And then non-natives, of course, from Europe, from Asia, from wherever else. And then from there, they can either be invasive or non-invasive. Generally, again, context matters, but that means invasive means they generally do harm. My favorite example of a native non-invasive is this little blue stem. It's a nice little warm season native bunch grass, and it makes really good habitat in the winter. And I like all of these little fluffy florets. An example of a non-native invasive is all of the brome grasses, which were brought over from Europe in the late 1800s for the purpose of forage and erosion control. People still use brome now, and there's kind of a debate whether it's good or bad, but it left unchecked, and especially left without fire, can create a monoculture. And as we all know, biodiversity is the key to any ecosystem. That's what keeps it strong. And then we also have our non-native, non-invasives, such as this little Deptford pink, which is a cute little flower. You can see it all through Spring Creek's prairies, but it is technically non-native, but it's not aggressive, so we don't really mind that it's there. For native invasives, we have eastern red cedar, which is technically a juniper, but for whatever reason, it's called a cedar. And I, just for reference, whenever I say cedar in the future, I'm talking about eastern red cedar. It's just a mouthful. And then some of our other woodies like sumac and dogwood that aren't great for prairies, but they are in fact from the United States. So, and then for the actual fire side of things, we have Wildland Fire, which gets talked about more than like the kind of prescribed fire we do around here. There's a lot of similarities and a couple differences. Like this BLM definition is closer to what goes on with Wildland Fire, and then this Pheasants Forever definition is a little closer to what we do with landowners around here. But the major similarities are that we all have land management objectives that we're trying to get by using fire. We put a lot of care into making sure that public safety and not burning down anything we're not supposed to be. And then we also pay attention to weather to make sure that it's safe and that we have good conditions. And then we're literally fighting fire with fire, which is what I will talk about a little bit. And as we go through these pictures, I want you to pay attention to, if you can see these blacked out edges, how cleanly we can get those to look. So it just shows the control that we have with this fire, which is very, very important. And then a very brief history of fire. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples have used fire for a variety of reasons: land stewardship, improving hunting land, all these different things. I am not an expert in this area. I wish I knew more, and I won't be talking a lot about this, but I highly recommend the Good Fire podcast if you do want to learn more. It's very interesting. And the first fire regulations in North America was in Canada in 1811, but the first one in the United States was in 1850, the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians Act. It disallowed burning because it was misunderstood and thought to be destructive and primitive, which obviously we know now isn't true, but that was the colonial view at the time. And so fire was suppressed up until 1968 and 1978, when the National Park Service and the Forest Service kind of saw the light and realized that we do in fact need fire, because they noticed the sequoias were no longer growing in California because sequoias forests are an ecosystem that evolved with fire and can't complete its life cycle without it. And we also saw the increase in wildfires that are still a problem. So up to now, prescribed fire is becoming and has become an integral, necessary management technique. And we're still fighting for indigenous people's rights to burn on their own land and trying to get more landowners to burn in different states. There's a big difference in use from state to state with fire. Like Oklahoma, I'm sure you've all noticed Kansas fires, Texas, Florida all burn really heavily. The Flint Hills in Kansas average about 2 to 2.5 million acres per year burned, whereas Nebraska only hits about 100,000, according to Pheasants Forever. And yeah, so I'm sure you've all noticed the smoke from them, but it's good in the end. So why do we burn? First of all, this map, Niobrara Valley Preserve, the black outline. Yeah, the Nature Conservancy headquarters right here. And then this was the 2012 wildfire that went through there that we can still see the results of today if you go down there. But they do prescribe fires. And so it's entirely possible that it could have been a lot worse had they not been burning already. Because every ecosystem has dead buildup of the prior year's thatch, dead grasses and leaves and branches, and that all makes very good kindling. So when all that builds up and then there's a spark, whether it's from lightning, a cigarette butt, just about anything, it can have devastating effects. So if you're burning that off periodically, you have a much lower chance of having a much bigger fire than if you were to just continue that history of suppressing it. We also use fire to manage invasive species. Some invasives like cedars and other woodies are really, really hard to get rid of. And once they have established in an open area like a prairie, they come back a lot quicker if you get rid of them. So it's better just to prevent them from happening in the first place with fire. But if you need to get rid of them, you already have them. Manually removing them either by sawing, spraying, whatever, it's really cost effective and not very time efficient compared to fire. But each one of those management techniques does definitely have a time and a place. So you can also use fire to improve grazing operations. So woody encroachment really hurts ag and grazing because, as you can see, all of these little dots throughout this property are cedars. And I'm not very far zoomed out from this land. That is a ton of cedars. I think that area is only about 40 acres. So when you have less open space, that means you have less grass, you have to lower your stocking rates, and grazing and cattle operations are already pretty tight profit margins. So you really have to be careful when you're losing productivity like that. It's not worth it. Because every 7-foot crown cedar removes about 3 pounds of forage. And if that doesn't sound like a lot, that equates to about every 50 cedars in an acre of land reduces productivity by about 10%, which is a really, really big deal. And then, of course, burning improves biodiversity. So when you have better biodiversity, your cows can pick, or whatever grazing animals can pick which plants they want to go to and eat. And they're very good at self-medicating. So if they're not feeling too good, maybe they go to one plant over another. They can shop around and see what they want. Kind of like when you're sick, you're not feeling too good, you want certain foods. And then that has actually been shown to improve gains over seasons when they can actually do that shopping around. One of the coolest things I think about managing prairies is all the things you can do to add wildlife habitat variants. So every single species has different things that they like about different habitats. Like I'm drawing a blank now. Like timberdoodles are really good, really cool wetland birds who you will almost never see because they hide so well, and they love overgrown wetlands. So by picking which patch you want to hay this year, which patch you want to graze or burn, or let rest, because resting is an incredibly valid management decision. Doing nothing is always a management decision. You're picking, or you're allowing different types of habitats to exist in the same property, giving these different animals choices of where they want to be. So for birds, and notice that this is grazing and burning. So, and these are all birds. Some of them have funny names, but they're all birds. So the Sprague's pipit really likes this shorter, less thatchy habitat. And like the LeConte sparrow really likes more overgrown stuff. And the big difference here between grazing and burning is that burning will burn off that thatch from years past, that dead stuff, whereas grazing will get a shorter stubble. So either way, you're achieving a more open habitat, but there are differences between those two management techniques. So everything boils down to soil health. And native plants here in the tall grass prairie and in different ecosystems evolved with fire. And they absolutely need fire to maintain their balance and to suppress woodies like we talked about and other invasive plants. So when you burn the past year's leaf litter, you're causing those nutrients to cycle back into the ground and the soil so that they can be used by the next season's plants. Very similar to how if you leave your leaf litter on your lawn, animals can use it to overwinter, animals and insects, importantly, can use it to overwinter, and then those nutrients slowly seep back into the soil. Burning does it a little faster, but it's the same principle. You want that cycle going on, and you want that variance in cycle. And so the oak savanna like this, it might look a little funny at first because it's not a forest, it's a savanna. You have these wide open spaces with that canopy of oaks, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And that fire comes in the understory and makes room for all of those great native sedges and forbs and grasses and takes out some of the younger woodies that aren't as fire resistant as oaks are. And kind of a sad fact, but a lot of these prairies haven't been exposed to fire for over 100 years now with our history of fire suppression. So just think about what that could do to nutrient cycling and like the richness of the soil and all of these ecosystems that need fire. It's very, you need that disruption. So some misconceptions. Naturally with fire, it's a very contentious subject. And it's really fun to talk to people about these kinds of things because it's mind-blowing, the stuff you can learn about it. So our first myth is that burning creates open ground and that leads to erosion. First, to give you a chance to look at this diagram, we've got our tall prairie plants, except for this one's turf grass. See how little roots there are, but the rest of these are prairie plants. And you can see that most of their root systems are at least as tall, if not twice as tall or more than their upper vegetation. So, yeah, and those deep root systems are what holds that soil in place because you're burning off this top stuff and then you're left with these roots still holding everything in place, and it's great. And back to the soil, these roots and everything hold the soil together and help with stormwater runoff, nutrient filtration, and then they improve drought resistance in our broader landscapes. Air quality is a big one. This looks like a lot of smoke. And trust me, when you're standing on this side in that crew, it feels like a lot of smoke. But the myth, prescribed fires are causing all the smoke in Lincoln or whatever town you're in, and it's terrible for air quality. But the truth is, generally, the smaller fires that we do, like this, don't put off enough smoke in the whole of the sky to really make that big of a difference in town. It's when we're talking about, like I mentioned, Kansas burning 2.5 million acres in a year that is what's causing the haze in our towns for the most part. And it's not necessarily a bad thing because we do check the air quality indices, and most of the time we're not getting that bad of air, which is great. But yeah, the smoke haze can get a bad rap for sure. So for climate change, myth is that fire contributes to climate change with all that smoke and removing all the vegetation. It feels like a bad thing. But in actuality, while a lot of the emissions are released by burning that vegetation and by running our equipment, the vast majority of the sequestered carbon in these prairie plants are in the soil and in the root systems. So you're not really releasing nearly as much, maybe 10%, I think it is. And if you weren't burning that off occasionally, we've talked about wildfire prevention, you'd be losing all of that carbon all at once if a wildfire went through. So it's kind of like inching that carbon emissions along instead of releasing them all at once. That's a lot worse. Yeah, and then of course the prairie landscape is made more resilient by using fire. And as climate change progresses, we're noticing temporal shifts in when different plants come out, like flowers are blooming later, and those pollinators need early blooming flowers. So that's a problem. And then the brome tends to come out about 2 weeks earlier than most native grasses. So another interesting thing you can do with fire is once you've burned a unit, you wait for that stubble of brome to come back, and then you put cows on it, and then you're hurting the brome twice, and making all that room for all those really, really good native prairie plants to come back in strong. And our final myth is that planting red cedars is great for wildlife because it creates new habitat. In truth, animals can indeed use cedars as habitat, but grassland species prefer grasslands. And when you plant cedars, you're taking that grassland away. A couple slides back, you guys saw the dotted cedars around the prairie, and a lot of animals don't like having spaces that aren't open like that. And grassland species are honestly more at risk than woodland species generally, because the prairie as a whole has been lost by about 98%, and it's the second most threatened ecosystem in the world. The sandhills are the second most intact grasslands in the world. And yeah, so we just really need to prioritize the grasslands. So just in case y'all have fell asleep, I've got a video to show you. This burn was last year. We had 2 crews going, and just to give you a little sneak peek of how we burn. So we all the 2 crews start at one point on the unit, and then we go opposite directions around and kind of meet back at the other side. So you make a big loop around it. It's a ring fire. So this is one crew, one side of the burn. Oh, we don't have sound again. Let me fix that real quick. Oh, Brianna, could you give me the host so that I could do the fire? Or
Yep.
not the fire, video.
You should be good now.
Well, thank you. Still not working. Okay, I'm gonna try one more thing, and if it doesn't work, then unfortunately it's gonna be a soundless video. If I can remember how to do this. Maybe I can't remember how to do this. Anyway, there's just some really dramatic music playing in the background. I will drop the links for the videos in the chat in a little bit, so you can listen to it later on. But you can see we've got a truck going up one side, and you can see those really even burn lines, which is what we want. And you can see like the fire heights stay pretty low, which is also what we want. We don't want raging fire. But this was a really fun burn to be on. We had a very minimal crew because of COVID, but it was well done. All right. So prescribed burn associations. Prescribed burn associations, we have close to a dozen in Nebraska, which is pretty good. And it's a bunch of landowners and volunteers who share equipment and resources and time to help each other burn. Tri-County Prescribed Burn Association covers Lancaster, Saline, and Seward counties. And I work with them a lot. And we help dozens of landowners every year, hundreds of acres safely burned. And we work with each of them to meet their individual management objectives every year. And some of those objectives we've already talked about, but they can be things like you have to burn for a CRP contract to get rid of woodies, or you want to improve your hunting land. So you want to get rid of some of the brush or create that habitat variance for specific critters, whatever you like to hunt. Or let's see, there was one guy down by Beatrice who actually set up his land through some burns for prairie chickens. And then my favorite reason for burning is to restore prairies, because a lot of that seed bank is still there, but when it gets overtaken by brome, you gotta help it come back out. So the beauty of these prescribed burn associations is that you share all of that equipment. And Tri-County has a deal with Pheasants Forever where there's a burn trailer we use, has 30 grand worth of equipment on top of the burn association's gear of all of this yellow Nomex, which is fire resistant protective equipment. We've got these burn pumps with these huge tanks of water, or drip torches, and all the different resources we need to be able to burn safely. Because a lot of the time, landowners know they want to burn, but they don't have the experience to do it safely. And that's where we come in. So a land manager might come to us and ask for help. We find out what they want to manage for, and then everybody piles on and helps them out. And you might be wondering who gives us the fire? Like, why do we get to do this? So Tri-County's been going on for many years now, and that has given all of these guys a ton of experience working on each other's land and working out all these different creative burns, because every land parcel is different and has its own challenges. Some of us have red cards, some of us have past red cards, but it's not required. It's just building up that knowledge over the course of many, many burns to be able to do it confidently and effectively. And anyone can burn their land outside of some city limits with the correct permissions from their fire chiefs. And of course, in compliance with any contracts. Like if you have CRP, you can't burn between July 15th and August 1st, May 15th and August 1st, because it's breeding bird season. But yeah, so this was a fun burn. It was on Prairie Legacy property. They do native seed sales. And you can see we have a ton of people on that fire line monitoring that very slow moving fire to make sure it didn't jump anywhere it wasn't supposed to. And on this was a CRP burn. Got those nice even lines. And we are so careful and meticulous about our planning that we're able to burn straight up to buildings. That's no problem. That's Spring Creek's main building right there. And then Ed here walking with a huge fire behind him. That's how much confidence we're able to have with crews this size. So prescribed burn associations are absolutely wonderful resources to have around. This is an example of one of the maps that I've made for an upcoming burn workshop that we're actually having in a couple of days, and I would love to see you all there. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But when a landowner approaches us, or an agency person, and they decide they want to burn, we go out and actually look at the property, because if you look at this map, you have no idea that this is a really deep draw, like this is a really steep hill. This gets marshy much sooner than you think. And those are all things you need to know before you get trucks out there driving on it with a bunch of fire. So we go out there, we do a land visit, we check out for any hazards, any areas we need to protect, like there's a sign here, like there's a new boardwalk here. What else? Any hazards that are inside the burner, like we're in unit, like there's a bunch of honey locusts with thorns in there, and you can't tell that from the picture. So you need to know that in advance. And then we let the landowner know what they need to do to prepare for that burn. So our land manager, in this case, this is on Spring Creek property, mowed an extra line here and here so that we would have a mowed walking trail and then like 10 inches of stubble and then tall grass prairie in here. So it gives you a ramp up of fire rather than really hot right next to you and right next to the trucks. And landowners will often do that like a couple months to a couple of days in advance. It just kind of depends on the burn. So once we get that burn plan approved, we get our burn permit, start looking for a good day to burn, because weather is incredibly important when it comes to burning safely. Because if your wind is too high, it's really easy to blow a spark over here, and we don't want this to burn. If our mixing height isn't good, then that smoke is just gonna like kind of plateau really low, and that's bad for us and the surrounding area, so we don't want that. We also pay attention to the temperature overall and the relative humidity, because if it's too humid out, the fire might not carry very well. And all kinds of different things. The air quality index, like I mentioned earlier. And then we do a crew call. So for this burn, it's only a little over an acre. We could do it with 2 people, but it's often a lot better and a lot safer to do it with more people. So we're going to have at least a 4-person crew on this one. Yeah, so you get your day, good weather, you get your burn permit, you got your crew, and you're ready to go. So say you get to burn day. You've got a wind coming out of the east, and it's going towards line AC here. Now, if you lit your fire right here, and you had one crew moving up towards A and the other crew moving towards C, your fire would be moving really quick and you'd be racing it. It'd be a really bad thing. You don't want to do that. So we start over here if the wind is out of the east, and then you've got a really slow burning backfire, and it gives you plenty of time to flank it and come around and get to this point together. And the whole time we're on our walkie-talkies chatting and making sure, not chatting, telling each other things we need to know. Like if you see any watch out things that are potentially concerning, if the fire is behaving in a way that makes you concerned and you want the other crew to know. If you have to pause for some reason, then the other crew doesn't get ahead of you. Because for the most part, you want to stay across from each other so that you're never sending fire at the other crew. So we spend a lot of time making sure that this goes down smoothly and safely. And then at the end of the day, burns all out. The landowner or land manager sticks around and makes sure that if there's any smoking logs in there or anything like that, they make sure they're out, because you don't want those to burn for overnight and possibly send up sparks. Because those logs can burn for a very long time, days even. You have to make sure all of that's good to go before you stop paying attention to a burn unit. And then, yeah, you come back later on and evaluate, landowner evaluates whether that burn met their objectives and what they want to do from there. Right. Spring Creek working map. So this is, I'm gonna move these videos. Spring Creek Prairie Audubon Center as a whole. Gray outline is our property boundary. We've got orange. These are our prescribed fires. Our grazing operations are in here. Our first pasture was actually this big rectangle, first pasture of the year. Then we moved the cows to this one. And now just this week, they moved into this third pasture, and we may have to move them again. Oops, sorry. Make that smaller again so you guys can see my pseudo legend here. So we've got all of these different burns and all of these different places, and it might look disjoint, but I promise that there's a reason for that. So we have 850 acres of mostly tallgrass prairie associated habitats. And we want to make sure we have as much variance in the landscape as we can. So by grazing this and putting the cows on it right away, we really knocked back the brome in this little section. But the rest of this wasn't touched as, or it wasn't grazed as hard because the cows were so interested in the new growth after this burn. So there's variance between those two. This was a creekside burn that we did. So that was more oak savanna than tallgrass prairie. So that was a really cool one to see. But that had entirely different objectives than the one we put in the grazing unit. And so by having these late grazed areas, early grazed areas, burned areas, we have all kinds of different habitats for our birds. And some of these other places are going to get hayed, some of the rest of them are going to get rested, and all of those management decisions let us rotate our parcels so we're not grazing the same places every year, because that's not great for the land either. It needs to recover every so often, and lets us really cater to our grassland birds. And generally, we try to get fire over the whole property every 5 years. So we're aiming for 150 acres every year. But for example, this year we only got about 86 because it was really hard to get burn units ready with COVID and the not having as many volunteers around. So we were a little bit behind, but that would happen in nature too. There would be years where even though the fire rolled through this area of the state about every 2 to 7 years, there would be years where less area was burned than others. So we don't sweat it too much. And plus we got a bunch of these little tiny units. So those take a lot of effort for a very quick burn. Got another video, unfortunately no music again, but I'll drop those in later. This is the other crew on that same burn from 2020. This one was a little trickier because on the left side of the screen would be where the building is. And then we also had to protect a wooden bridge, you can see there. We had one person that was just standing there dedicated to spraying it down for the whole time the fire was going through. But each of these crews had about 5 people in them, which is a solid crew. Yeah. And then post-burn, one of our smallest units, which we're going to use as a demo site for the upcoming burn workshop, was only about 1/4 of an acre. It took us like an hour to do, but it was fun. We burned it on July 30th, and then 25 days later, look how much growth we have. It was only about 2.5 centimeters of rain, so it could have been a lot more growth. But you can see it's a big difference. And in the spring, it would be a lot taller grass, but it just goes to show how quickly the land bounces back after a fire. And then we have that same burn that we've been watching videos for. This was a few days post-burn in May 2020, and 5 months later. I think that's pretty cool. Like, you've got all that big blue stem. Big blue does really, really good at the year after a fire in prairies, but just a big change. So if you are interested in burning with us, you don't need any experience. We would love to have you. Landowners, if you're interested in having your property burned, it is very inexpensive, and you just have to do a couple burns with us. And you are all welcome to contact me if you're interested for whatever reason, or go ahead and email Tri-County. So in next week, we have a burn workshop coming up for a growing season burn, which is a little different than a fall spring burn, just because you've got a lot more vegetation. It's a lot more humid, slow going, but it's very fun. So yeah, there is the registration link here if you're interested. We will be burning the unit that I had on the map that I showed you a few minutes prior. And yeah, you'll get to see the up close and personal, that little 1/4 acre unit that I showed you with the slider too. Got a lot planned. It's going to be a good one. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Cacey. I appreciate it. And really quick, can you send us back the host access?
Oh yeah, sorry.
So then we can get questions. No, you're okay. But everybody that's still on, please throw your questions in the chat box. I know we have a few, and I know we had a few beforehand too. But one question from earlier, do you know any organizations that maybe in the Beatrice area that serve Gage County?
I don't off the top of my head, but if you're willing to either drop your email or contact info, otherwise I'll drop mine in the chat, and then if you give me an email about Gage County, I will get that to you. Get that information.
And I'll write that down too. And then a couple more. What are the costs involved with a prescribed burn? Sorry, take a second.
No, you're good. You're good.
I'm rushing.
You're fine. So when you burn with a prescribed burn association, don't quote me on this because it really depends on the unit on the land, but usually it's only a couple $100 because we have all of that shared equipment. You mostly have to pay for fuel. Yeah, it's mostly fuel. And but yeah, if you were to do that all on your own, like grip torches run over $100 just for a torch, and then all of the fuel you have to put in it, making sure you have a water tank, it gets really expensive. And I don't have those numbers, but it's very worth using a prescribed burn association. The membership fee is for a landowner is $50 a year, and you only have to do 2 burns with us per year. And it doesn't even have to be you. You can send your kid. You can send your neighbor if they're willing. You can send anybody in your place, and that they'll count towards your 2.
Prescribed burn associations are just incredible. I absolutely love it.
It's so cool.
Okay. Sorry. So the registration questions that we had are how close to trees do you want to get to save? Let me read this quick. How close to trees that you want to save can burns be done?
Oh, so how close can we get to the trees without burning them?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, mowing around them does help for sure, because anytime you make that gap between like you get that really low green stubble, it's not going to carry the fire. You have to pay attention if it's in the early spring or late fall. If it's really dead leaves, you don't want to, or if it's damaged, you want to make sure it doesn't get up in the cambium. But yeah, you can get pretty close, especially if you mow around it without much worry. And if there's no ladder fuel, so if there's nothing connecting the ground up to the canopy of the trees, it's pretty safe.
Rock on. And a very similar question, how close to houses or acreages? Is it pretty similar to trees?
Yeah, so your biggest issues with burning up close to buildings is if you have any like generators or plastic tubing or anything that can melt. But otherwise, again, if you burn a 10-foot minimum break around just about anything, you're pretty good to go.
Awesome. And then our last registration question, they are hoping to burn their small acreage next spring. They have about 2 acres of prairie grassland on a 4-acre lot, and they're interested in what the best time of year is to do it. And they started looking into it with the local fire department last year, but was too late in the season and was hoping to discuss it with you. And hopefully we can email them back and you guys can get chatting because they're super interested.
Yeah, that'd be great. It really depends on what you're trying to manage for. So if you're trying to just maintain prairie, the best thing you can do is knock back cool season plants, because cool seasons have become dominant on our landscape. And like the big four of tall grass prairies, big blue, little blue, switchgrass, Indian grass, are all warm seasons. And by hurting those cool seasons like brome, you promote those prairie plants, those warm seasons. Yeah, so for later in the summer. So burning in the fall or spring would be really good. But again, if you would like to email me or Tri-County, we can get a little bit more specific, maybe do a site visit.
Perfect, and I'll get you that information. And then another question, what kind of paperwork is needed to do a burn? Yeah.
So the burn plan Tri-County uses is about 8 pages long, which sounds scarier than it is. It basically just details like the topography of the area, what your burn what your burn objectives are, and what your equipment requirements are for that burn, and then like the weather conditions that you're looking for the burn day. Yeah, there's 8 main things that you need to have in a burn plan that I can't list off the top of my head, but it's not too bad. And then you have to turn that into a fire chief for your permit, like the day of or the week of the burn. But it can vary from each jurisdiction, so.
Definitely very you have to be knowledgeable to get it all down to a science. Anne was wondering, is the seminar addressed at SPCAP? I'm not sure if she's talking about the workshop or.
I'll type in the chat.
Yes, and just so everybody knows, tomorrow I'm going to send a follow-up information with just some links that we shared in this webinar. And if you guys have any other questions, definitely put it in and we can address that and send that out to everybody too, just to give you guys a little bit more knowledge and some reading material. But yeah, and then our last question right now is how prescribed burns release nutrients back into the soil. What are these nutrients?
Oh, the tough questions. I haven't taken organic chemistry in a while, to be honest. But okay, so when you burn something, it's reduced back down to carbon. If you let plants decompose as they are, it's phosphorus, nitrogen, much like the fertilizer that you'd put in your yard or on crops. So putting that carbon back into the soil lets the future growth of plants utilize it quicker. And then also just different types of plants put different nutrients, either that nitrogen or phosphorus, into the soil anyway. For example, beans fix nitrogen, which the chemistry escapes me at the moment, but you need beans in your prairie because they put that nitrogen when most of the grasses are phosphorus heavy. So you need that balance. Very similar to how you rotate corn and soybeans, same principle.
I love it. So before we get to any more questions, I'm just going to do a little bit of a spiel. There's going to be a poll that pops up on everybody's screen. We would really appreciate you guys doing it. It only takes a couple seconds, and it just helps us get better information on for future webinars and events. So with that being said, get your questions in, your last minute questions in the chat box. But Anne was referring to, Spring Creek Prairie Audubon, and her question, sorry, is the seminar at Spring Creek Prairie? And that's a yes, correct?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Is it okay if I share my screen again, show the people the flyer?
Yes, please do.
There you go. Feel free to screenshot that or whatever.
Perfect. And I'll also put that in the email too. So that'll be perfect. So
Thank you.
everybody has it. Rock. So while you guys are reading through that, I just want to again reiterate, if you guys have any last minute questions, throw them in the chat box now. But other than that, thank you so much, Cacey. You were an absolute delight to listen to. And the knowledge you have about prescribed fires is absolutely wild. I just can't even. But otherwise, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and coming to learn. We really appreciate each and every one of you. And again, my name is Brianna Coma with Conservation Nebraska. And if you missed anything, the recording of this will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. And again, I will send a follow-up email with some extra information from our webinar tonight that you guys can read over and share with friends or whatever. But otherwise, check out our Facebook page for more events. And we really hope to see you guys soon in the future at events or webinars or just out and about on a prescribed fire. All right. Any last minute questions? Last chance. We have 5 seconds. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night. And thank you again, Cacey.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.